Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining me. This is Kathy, and today I'll be creating a slimline card using the Woodland Buddies stamp set from the Not Too Shabby Shop, as well as the Stitched Squares slimline dies from Trinity Stamps. I started out by stamping the images onto a piece of Cougar Super Smooth cardstock with My Favorite Things Extreme Black Hybrid ink. Both the ink and the cardstock are alcohol marker friendly, and I'll be doing some Copic coloring. I started out by coloring the little hedgehog, and I started with E79. I added my darkest color along the very edge of his quills or fur. I'm not sure which one they have. And then I added little flick marks kind of randomly over the rest of his quills, just so that I could have some detail and some definition within those quills. Next, I came in with E77 and I extended out the E79 along his body and also did the random flicking motion just to add more texture to his quills. I came in with E74 and started to blend all of that out. And once I did that, I came back in with the E79 just to darken up some of the random quills that I had done earlier. For his body, I used E53 and E31. I started with the E31 and concentrated that color closest to the quills, as well as underneath his chin, underneath his little hand, and at the top of his feet where his body would be casting a shadow on his feet. I blended that out with the E53. Then I came back in with the E31 just to reinforce some of those shadows. So this stamp set has been on my wish list for quite some time, and I just love how whimsical the little critters are. And then I saw a card done by Marla Harris, and that was it. I knew I had to have the stamp set. Anyway, she created a card using the same stamp set, but she did no line watercoloring. I'll make sure to link to her YouTube channel in the description below. I encourage you to check out her channel because she creates some beautiful cards. Anyway, next I move on to the bunny. For the bunny, I decided to use warm gray markers. I started with W4 and added in the shadows where they would be along the top of her head, on the sides of her face. I also went underneath that flower because the flower would be casting a shadow on her face. I did flicks from the top of her nose up towards the top of her head just to darken that area up a little bit. Next, I came in with W3 and extended those shadows out just a little bit. After I was done with the W3, I came in with W1 and colored in the rest of the white space. I thought that there was a little bit too much contrast on the bridge of her nose where I had done the W4 and the W3. So I brought in W2 and did a quick swipe over her face as well as the top of her feet just to blend those out a little bit more. For the front of her nose and for her belly, I started with E42 and I concentrated that up along the top of the top part of her nose and then also the top part of her belly. I blended that out with E41. Then I moved on to coloring in the inside of her ears, and I started with R00 and blended that out with R20. After I colored the inside of her ears with the pink, I decided that I needed to add a little bit more definition on the outer edge of her ears, so I just did a really thin line of the W2. For the flower in her hair, I started with R24 and concentrated that around the very center of the flower. Then I blended that out with R22 and decided that the center of the flower needed to have a little bit more definition, or it needed to be pushed back a little more, so I just did a little bit of R59 and then I blended that out with the R24. For the squirrel, I started with E39 and again added in the darkest areas at the top of his head and around the sides of his face. I did a little bit on his body and on his tail. Then I decided that I needed to have a darker shadow where his tail is right up against his face. So I brought in E29 and did a little bit there and also at the base of his tail. Then I went back to the E39 and continued adding in a little bit more shading, making sure to leave some white space on his tail. Next, I came in with E09 and extended those shadows out a little bit, and I did fill in some of the white space on his tail, but I made sure to leave some white space just so that I could have a nice highlight. Next, I went back to the E39 and blended that out a little bit, and then went in and filled the rest of the white space in with the E99. And I kind of wish that I would have stopped right there because I kept adding more and more layers of color. And the poor little guy, his face ended up being a little bit too dark. But I had already done the coloring and I really didn't want to start over, so I just left him as is. For his belly, I also used E42 and E41. I concentrated the E42 up at the top of his belly and blended that out with the E41. For his ears, I used the same colors as I did with the bunny. I started with R20 and then blended that out with R00. Once I was done with the coloring, I fussy cut those images, and I had die cut a piece of Neenah 80-pound Classic Crest cardstock using the smallest stitched slimline rectangle die from Trinity Stamps. I thought the critters needed to be standing on something so it didn't look like they were just randomly floating in the air. So I placed them where I wanted to have them on my card, and then I used one of the little grassy stamps from the My Favorite Things Scene Builder stamp set. I stamped the grass using My Favorite Things Jelly Bean Green ink. Then I brought in Tumbled Glass Distress Oxide ink just to add a little bit of color behind the little critters. I wanted the ink blending to be darker at the bottom and kind of fade out up into white, so I used a heavier hand at the bottom and worked my way up. And I did use a makeup blending brush to do the ink blending. I used YG03 to add just a little bit of a line underneath the stamped grass. Distress Oxide inks, because it's kind of a pigment ink, it'll sit on top of the cardstock, and it kind of faded out the grass that I had stamped. So I just re-stamped them and lined them up as best as I could, and I figured it's grass, so if I didn't get them stamped perfectly, that's okay. And then to blend out the YG03, I just used my colorless blender and just did one quick swipe. I set that off to the side and then started working on my sentiments. And for the sentiments, I used two more stamp sets from My Favorite Things. The first two sentiments are from the Sweetest Wishes set, and as you can see, I lined up the fishtail banner die on my cardstock first, and then I placed the stamps where I wanted them to be within that fishtail banner die. I stamped the sentiments with Versamark ink and coated it with white embossing powder and heat set it with my heat tool. The Happy Birthday sentiment is from a different stamp set. It's from the Hello Beautiful set, which is also from My Favorite Things. I did the same thing. I stamped that with Versamark, coated it with detail white embossing powder, and heat set it. Then I ran all of the sentiments through my Gemini Junior die cutting machine with that fishtail banner die. And then it was time to start putting my card together. I adhered the little critters using my AdTech tape runner. And for the squirrel, because I didn't fussy cut that space out between his head and his tail, and to make it blue, I just colored in that white space using a B000 marker. I cut the sentiments down so that they would fit on the front of the card, and I adhered those in place with liquid glue. I had run a piece of green cardstock through my Gemini Junior with the second largest rectangle from the Slimline die set by Trinity, and adhered my stamped panel to that. Next, I adhered that to the front of my Slimline card, which is cut from 80-pound Neenah Classic Crest cardstock. I cut it to 8.5 by 7 and scored it at 3.5 and folded it in half. So the finished size of the card is 3.5 by 8.5. I thought that I was done with the card, but then I decided that I wanted to add just a little something more to the front of the card. So I grabbed these little bee sets from the Be Happy stamp set by Pink and Main. I used VersaFine Onyx Black ink to stamp those, and then I remembered that I wanted to color them in with Copics, so I had to be pretty careful when I colored them in. For the bee body, I used Y13, and for the wings, I used BG00. I used a fine tip black pen to add a little eye on each of the bees. Then I used my Wink of Stella glitter pen to add some sparkle to their wings, and decided that the little bees needed to have a buzzy trail, so I used a fine tip black marker and just did tiny little dots in a kind of a swirly, buzzy trail motion. And that's it. That finishes up my card for today. Thank you so much for joining me. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, I'd love it if you would. And don't forget to ring the bell so you're notified every time a new video is posted. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.